A body is found on the edge of the Everglades. It's a man in his 40s. He's been shot. There's nothing else around. There's sawgrass, there's a few dirt roads and a couple of paved roads. It's as far west as you can go in Miami-Dade County. Now, this is in the 1980s, so finding a body that's shot out there, unfortunately, wasn't real unusual. However, this man didn't have a drug past. And what's even more unusual, there's a small encampment about half a mile away where a man and a woman and their little 4-year-old daughter are living in a tent at the edge of a pond. What are they doing there? And what do they know about this man's death? The answers to this, the murder at Moonberry Pond, coming up. Stick around.
Welcome to Nothing But the Truth, the podcast about investigations and how you can become a better detective. This is the no BS, no Hollywood nonsense real deal. Now here's your host, Detective Rom.
Welcome back. It's another episode of Nothing But the Truth, the podcast that makes investigations better by helping you become a better investigator. I'm Ramesh Nyberg, Detective Rom. It's great to be with you again. And thank you for listening, and I hope you've had a chance to listen to previous episodes and get some real value out of it and help you in your career. Today we're going to start on a new format where we're going to continue having guests. However, every so often we're going to have a case study on a homicide that I was involved with during my career in the Miami-Dade Police Department. The purpose for this is for you to see how these homicides were solved so that you can take away some of the things we've talked about in terms of the 10 must-haves to be a great detective, the skills, the attributes, and the strategies that are used to solve a case. They're applicable in any type of investigation. So before we get too much into this, let me just give you some contact information because I always want you to be able to let me know what you think of these episodes and hear your feedback. It's very important to me to know who you are and how I can help you. You can always email me, truth@nybergpi.com. Truth, like nothing but the truth, at nybergpi, nybergpi.com. Or you can go to Twitter and you can get me on Twitter at nybergpi. You can also look up our Facebook page, the Nothing But the Truth podcast. These podcasts are also on YouTube. Nothing But the Truth podcast is our YouTube channel, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. So let's find out what the story was with this murdered man. James Mixon was his name. This case happened back in 1987. Our murder rate had jumped back up after a small dip in the numbers in the mid-'80s. And Mr. Mixon was not a drug dealer. He was not a guy that anybody would kidnap because he had virtually no money. In fact, he was an alcoholic, a bad one. And wherever he went, he ran into conflict with his own family members. He was constantly losing jobs, getting kicked out of various houses, and nobody really wanted anything to do with him. He ended up finding a state park called Chiquita State Park, which is way out on the edge of the Everglades. It's actually in the Everglades. He was able to take his Ford Bronco there and camp out there for $8 a night. So his money was starting to run out, and he was getting desperate. And whatever leftover money he had, he was using to buy beer and getting drunk every night and causing havoc in the park. So even Chiquita State Park didn't want him after a while, and he got kicked out of there. About 2 miles south of Chiquita State Park, Mixon's body is found shirtless, face down, in a field surrounded by brush and some sawgrass, and he's shot in the back of the head several times. When we went out there, we looked around and we didn't see much, but after we left Chiquita State Park, we noticed some color off in the distance, and out there's nothing much but greens and tans of sawgrass and some small trees. So I got out my binoculars, and lo and behold, there's a Confederate flag and what looked like the corner of a tent kind of peeking out through some trees across on the other side of a pond. So we looked around, checked it out. We couldn't really get there without driving through a large ditch full of water, but we could see a vehicle there, and the vehicle looked like it was some sort of SUV or truck that had been painted, amateurishly painted this camouflage design, right, with black and green and brown stripes all over it. Well, we set up a surveillance, and we waited for the people to come out. We didn't know when they would come out, but lo and behold, a couple hours after sitting on the surveillance, this couple in their 30s comes out onto the main road, and we stop them. What happens after that gets really interesting, and what we find in the console of the vehicle in plain view when we stop them is really intriguing. I'll be right back to finish the story right after this. Hey, I have a lot of experience in investigations, but when it comes to podcasting, I was a complete and utter rookie. In police work, we had these people called field training officers that helped new people learn the ropes. And I was in dire need of a podcasting field training officer, but I didn't know where to turn. So I started Googling and looking around, and I found Buzzsprout. And Buzzsprout turned out to be my choice to have my podcast published. Buzzsprout is so easy to use. They got my show listed in every major podcast platform, gave me a nice-looking website where all my episodes are listed. And, using it was really intuitive, very easy to learn, and I've never even called their tech support, which for me is pretty unusual. So if you're interested in doing your own podcast, you should really consider Buzzsprout. They have lots of help videos on YouTube that'll guide you through the process and make it seamless. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout. Get your message out to the world. So what happened to James Mixon, and who were these people that were camping on the edge of the pond? Well, they were a couple named Ruth and Jason Brunson. They had a little girl with them who was about 4 years old, blonde hair, cute as can be, sitting in the back of this truck when we stopped it. But what was really concerning was when we stopped the vehicle, right in the console of this Ford truck was a large revolver just sitting there. They never even tried to hide it. And we got it out of the vehicle so that it wasn't within arm's reach while we were talking to them. And we asked them if they would be okay with us doing some tests on it. And they were fine with that. We also asked them for the registration to the truck. And this is where the story gets very intriguing and where our suspicions of this couple first started. They said that a guy named Jim Mixon, that's our dead guy, sold them the truck. When I asked them where James Mixon was, they said they didn't know. And when I told them that James Mixon was dead, they said, really? And they were trying to pretend to be shocked, but it wasn't very convincing. Body language is a very interesting thing. And when you're talking to people or telling them something that should shock them, think about how you would respond or how the average person would respond. One thing I noticed that when I told them James Mixon was dead is they didn't even look at each other, which I thought was strange. Nor did they ask how he died or where he was found. I think those would be things that an innocent person would naturally want to know, don't you? Well, they didn't have a registration for the truck. What they had was a handwritten note that basically said, I, James Mixon, hereby sell my 1982 Ford Bronco to Ruth and Jason Brunson. And it was signed, supposedly, by Mr. Mixon. So we asked them if we could take that, and we asked them if they wouldn't mind giving us some handwriting samples. And they agreed to all of this. They also agreed to be interviewed. Now, our crime lab had a small unit called the Questioned Documents section. And these guys were absolute experts in their field at handwriting analysis, document analysis. They were wizards when it came to working with ink, paper, anything like that. On a routine basis, they would get suicide notes that we would find, make sure the suicide note was written by the victim. And of course, in this situation, you need to have a standard, right, which is a known standard that the victim wrote, and the questioned document to compare it against. So at this point, they followed us to the nearest substation, which was about a good 30 to 40 minutes away in the South District of Miami-Dade County, where I used to be a uniform officer, and we talked to them separately. Now, this is where we start talking about interviewing skills, interviewing techniques, watching body language, and listening to statements. One of the things that caught my attention was the little girl was sitting next to Ruth, and Jason was being interviewed in a separate interview room. I sat with Ruth and the little girl, who they called Muffin, and Muffin sat there playing with a doll she had, and we found out that Muffin, this cute little girl that lived there on this pond and apparently was raised out there in that tent, would have nicknames for all of the little animals that were out there. And again, they're on the edge of the Everglades. There were raccoons and there were all kinds of creatures out there. And there was a little alligator who lived in the pond, and she named it Tater. Tater the gator, of course. She also had a little kitten that she named Moonberry. And the mother explained all this to us. It turned out these folks were living out there with an arrangement they had with the state of Florida. You see, nearby, there was a large communications antenna that was maintained by the state of Florida and used for things like the rangers in the Everglades to transmit on their radios and things of that nature. Apparently, the antenna had been vandalized and the chain link gate surrounding the antenna had been cut open and people had been going in there and vandalizing the place. So Ruth and Jason apparently met a park ranger who made arrangements for them to live out there and keep people from going down that road to damage the antenna. It was a great little arrangement for both the state of Florida and the Brunsons. That's how they came to be there. So as I was interviewing Ruth Brunson about how they came to know James Mixon, she told me that he showed up one day at their campsite saying that he needed a place to live and that he was a good fisherman. He could help them catch fish. He had a fishing rod in his truck. And they thought, okay, it might be a good idea. So they let him stay there. And apparently he did help them fish and do certain things, gather firewood for their evening fire and things of that nature. I asked Ruth about his demeanor because we already knew a few things about Mixon, right? We knew he was a drunk. We knew he could get nasty at times. And she said, yeah, he would be somewhat annoying, but not a big deal. Now, the little girl hadn't said a thing up until that point, but all of a sudden, she blurted out, he was mean to Moonberry. Moonberry being her little kitten. Now, Ruth Brunson, up until that point, had been pretty calm and pretty collected during this interview, but when her daughter blurted out that comment about Mixon being mean to Moonberry, she blew up at the kid. She said, don't you dare interrupt Mama when I'm talking. Now you shut up and be quiet. It was kind of alarming, and the kid, of course, did shut up. I made a mental note that we needed to follow up on that and maybe somehow try and talk to Muffin alone, but that was going to be difficult to do. Nothing incriminating came of the interviews. They said that Mixon sold them this truck, they painted it, and Mixon one day said he was leaving for North Carolina, and somebody came to pick him up. Now, our investigation had to go and disprove all that. So we let them go, and we went back to headquarters, and we tested the gun, and we tested the handwriting. We had some handwriting from Mixon that we got from his family, and as you might imagine, the handwriting on the bill of sale that the Brunsons said Mixon wrote did not match at all. In fact, the handwriting matched that of Jason Brunson. So we knew now that the bill of sale for the truck was completely fraudulent and falsified. We were getting somewhere. The very next day, we got the ballistic results from the handgun that we found in the Brunsons' truck, and it matched the projectiles that were removed from James Mixon's head during the autopsy. They were in possession of the murder weapon. Now we had a lot. We arrested Jason and Ruth on falsifying a vehicle registration, and we brought them into the homicide office for some more detailed interview. Again, we separated them. I this time talked to Jason, and my partner, Nick, who was an excellent young investigator and was pretty new in the unit, but very, very sharp, interviewed Ruth in a separate room. And I could tell that things were deteriorating with Jason. He was telling lies that just were inconsistent, kept telling different stories. And I confronted him about it. I said, Jason, we know you're involved. You falsified the bill of sale. You've got the murder weapon sitting in your truck. Why don't you just tell me what happened, what you did, and how James Mixon came to be dead? During these interviews, you have to be careful about how you word things. You don't ever want to ask, did you kill James Mixon? You don't ever want to use the word kill or murder when you're talking to someone who might be suspected of such a thing. You want to soften your words. In fact, you want to try and tap into people's motivations and their justifications. What do I mean by that? So when somebody commits a crime, they usually find a way to justify it in their own heads. So we had a perfect opportunity here to imagine a situation where perhaps James Mixon might have made a move on Ruth. Could that have caused Jason to kill him? Sure, it could have. There could be a number of different scenarios. Well, I kept working on Jason, and he wasn't budging, but he kept getting more and more nervous, and his story was making less and less sense. And it looked like he was getting ready to try and tell me when the door to my interview room opened, and Nick peeked his head in and said, Ram, I need to talk to you. And I said, not now, Nick. I'm getting somewhere. I was whispering to Nick and saying, this is going well. And he looked at me and smiled and said, Ram, Ruth just confessed to the murder. What was the story? Why did she kill James Mixon? You'll find out in just a minute. Hey, if you're enjoying Nothing But the Truth and you would like to help keep the show going and support the show, I urge you to go to patreon.com/Detective Rom and look at the different tiers there that you can join to be a patron of the show and help it out. There's some really great benefits. You can get my training videos for free. You can get my book, The 10 Must-Haves to Be a Great Detective, for free. So check it out, patreon.com/Detective Rom. I would be honored if you would support the show, and of course you'll get a shout out on one of our episodes. So what did Ruth tell my partner Nick? The story goes like this. Mixon came to live with the Brunsons, just as Ruth had described to me before in the initial interview we had with them. But what happened one night was that James Mixon got annoyed with Muffin, the little girl. The little girl was crying about something, being a typical little toddler and crying and whining. Mixon was drunk, he was upset, and he grabbed Moonberry, the little kitten, her precious little pet, and threw it into the pond where, yes, you guessed it, Tater the gator, the little 3-foot baby alligator that lived in the pond, immediately grabbed Moonberry, took her under the surface, and that was the end of Moonberry. Now, little Muffin, who had been upset before, was completely inconsolable, shrieking to high heaven. Ruth, as you might imagine, was enraged. She said some things to Mixon, and Mixon just grumbled and walked away. But in her head, she was planning something far more sinister. What she did then was, later in the evening, she went to Mixon and she said, "Hey, I need some help gathering some firewood. Let's go in the truck and you can help me get firewood and bring it back." Mixon, being drunk and being stupid, didn't care, got in the truck with her. They drove out to the site where they usually collect firewood. And while Mixon was distracted, she took the .357 Magnum that they kept for protection and shot him in the head. She opened the door to the passenger side of the truck, pulled him out, his body flopped down onto the ground, and she put 3 more in the back of his head just to make sure that James Mixon would never again torture her little daughter. Ruth Brunson pled not guilty, and we went to trial. She was convicted, and she got a life sentence. Now, back then, life came with a 25 minimum mandatory, which meant you had to do 25 years before you could come up for a parole hearing and possibly get out. After that, there were periodic parole hearings that an inmate could request. Well, Ruth won a parole hearing in November of 2020. Just last year, she is out on supervised parole and living in Massachusetts. Jason was convicted on the minor crimes that we charged him with, including accessory to murder after the fact. He's out, and I have no idea whatever happened to him. Muffin went to the West Coast where her grandparents lived and apparently ended up living a normal life in a normal home, not in a tent. That's the story of the murder at Moonberry Pond. If it sounds like something out of some weird fairy tale, well, I assure you, it's absolutely true. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you got something out of it. I hope that you learned some of the techniques that were important in this case. Let's go over them real quickly. When interviewing people, you have to watch body language and listen to statements very carefully. Now, back at the homicide office, during the second interview, we ran into something I guess you could call gender bias. I assumed that Jason was the one that did the killing. Why? Because men kill with much greater frequency than women do. It didn't dawn on me that Ruth had planned the killing all by herself. But that's why everyone that you think might be involved or might have knowledge needs to be interviewed separately, and the interviews need to be done skillfully. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the murder at Moonberry Pond. We'll be doing many more of these types of homicide case summaries here on Nothing But the Truth. Hey, don't forget to go to Amazon.com, pick up a copy of my book, The 10 Must-Haves to Be a Great Detective. I think I even talk about this case in the book. In the meantime, please leave some feedback if you enjoy this. Subscribe to the podcast. I'd love to hear from you. I always love to hear what you like to hear, what you'd like to hear more of on this podcast. So take care, and remember, always put your best foot forward, but don't forget to work on your other foot. All right, we'll see you next week.